In 1962, Hollywood had two queens. Elizabeth Taylor was paid $1 million to play Cleopatra, pampered by the studio like a queen, even though she continuously delayed filming. At the same time, on the set next door, Marilyn Monroe, the star earning the most money for the studio, was paid a cheap salary and forced to work to exhaustion. To save Liz Taylor's project from bankruptcy, the studio coldly sacrificed Marilyn, firing her, publicly humiliating her. A few weeks later, Marilyn passed away. This is the story of how Hollywood killed a legend to feed another legend. The paradox of that summer lies in these two simultaneous images. On one side of the Atlantic, a production is allowed to spiral into financial madness, indulged with the reverence of a religious ritual. On the other side, a production is being strangled by austerity and suspicion. The public believed these two women were rivals, fighting for the crown of Hollywood's greatest sex symbol. The tabloids fueled this narrative, pitting the dark, violet-eyed siren against the platinum blonde innocent. They printed stories of jealousy, of divas clashing over the spotlight. This narrative was a lie. The conflict destroying Marilyn Monroe was a war of numbers fought in the boardrooms of New York City. The 20th Century Fox Film Corporation was dying. The studio had bet its entire existence on the success of Cleopatra, a gamble that had gone catastrophically wrong. The budget had ballooned from $2 million to over $30 million, sucking the liquidity out of the company like a parasite. The studio was technically insolvent. The board of directors, terrified of a shareholder revolt, needed to demonstrate control. They could not touch Elizabeth Taylor. She was the face of their investment, the only hope for recouping their millions. If Cleopatra failed, the studio died. They were hostages to her stardom. So they looked for a victim elsewhere. They needed a scapegoat to sacrifice on the altar of fiscal responsibility, a public execution to prove to the banks that they were still ruthless, still in charge. They looked at the ledger and saw Marilyn Monroe. She was older now. She was frequently ill. She was demanding script approval. She was, in the cold calculus of the accountants, a depreciating asset. The decision forming in the minds of the executives that June was purely arithmetic. To save the Queen of the Nile, they would have to execute the blonde bombshell. While often remembered as a story of personal demons, the tragedy of 1962 was driven by the cold machinery of the studio system. Marilyn Monroe's destruction began with a pill bottle, but it was engineered by a budget report. As the sun went down on her 36th birthday, the mechanisms of her destruction were already grinding into motion. Spyro Skouras, the president of 20th Century Fox, sat in his office in New York staring at the terrifying figures coming out of Rome. He was a man who had survived poverty and war to build an entertainment empire, but he was now watching it crumble piece by piece. The board was demanding heads on pikes. Skouras knew his own job was on the line. He needed a distraction. He needed a villain. He looked at the reports from Los Angeles, detailing Marilyn's sinus infection, her absences, her delays. A grim realization took hold. If he could paint Marilyn as the symbol of Hollywood's excess and indiscipline, if he could make an example of her, he might just buy himself enough time for Cleopatra to open and save them all. The strategy was set. The studio would not help their star rise. They would actively push her into the abyss. The architecture of the disaster was built on panic. By early 1962, the ledger books of 20th Century Fox were terrifying. The studio reported a loss of over $40 million for the fiscal year, a staggering sum that threatened to trigger a total liquidation of assets. The golden age of Hollywood was over, murdered by the glowing blue light of television sets in living rooms across America. Audiences were staying home, and the old guard of studio moguls, men like Spiros Skouras, were scrambling to find a weapon to fight back. Skouras believed the answer lay in spectacle, widescreen epics, thousands of extras, technicolor grandeur that a small TV screen could never replicate. He bet the farm on Cleopatra. It was a wager that went wrong from the very first day. The production had begun in London, a city entirely unsuited for a film about Egypt. The damp English weather nearly killed Elizabeth Taylor, who contracted a respiratory infection so severe she required an emergency tracheotomy to breathe. The production shut down. Millions of dollars of sets, costumes, and salaries evaporated into the fog, while the star fought for her life in a hospital bed. When she recovered, the entire circus was moved to Rome, but the bleeding did not stop. The Roman sets had to be built from scratch. The script was being written nightly by anxious screenwriters who were handed pages of dialogue still wet with ink. The director, Joseph L. Mankiewicz, was shooting during the day and writing all night, fueled by amphetamines and fear. The studio was so desperate for cash to feed the beast in Rome that they did the unthinkable. They sold the land beneath their own feet. Skouras sold 260 acres of the studio's historic backlot in Los Angeles to the Aluminum Company of America to develop what is now Century City. They were literally dismantling the dream factory to pay for a single movie. Every dollar from that land sale was wired immediately to Italy, disappearing into the pockets of Italian construction unions, hotel owners, and the entourage of Elizabeth Taylor. The board of directors in New York watched the wire transfers with growing horror. They began to whisper that Skouras had lost his mind, that he was suffering from a Cleopatra complex, unable to stop throwing good money after bad. The paradox of the summer of 1962 was a tale of two cities. In Rome, Elizabeth Taylor's set was a sovereign state of excess where the studio paid to fly chili from Beverly Hills across the Atlantic because she craved a taste of home. In Los Angeles, Marilyn Monroe's set was a prison. While Liz was treated as a high-strung thoroughbred whose illnesses were tragic, Marilyn was treated as a delinquent employee whose illnesses were treason. Skouras couldn't scream at the Queen in Rome, who was costing him millions. So he vented his rage on the Queen in Hollywood, who cost him pennies. He needed a sacrifice to balance the books, and the math was simple. To save the Queen of the Nile, he would execute the blonde bombshell. To the millions of fans who bought tickets to see her luminous face projected onto the silver screen, Marilyn Monroe was the embodiment of the American dream. She was the orphan who became a queen, the factory worker who became a deity, the woman who had everything. She was draped in white mink, dripping in borrowed diamonds, and chauffeured in limousines that glided through the streets of Beverly Hills like ocean liners. But this image was the greatest performance of her life, a carefully constructed illusion designed to hide a brutal economic reality. By the spring of 1962, the woman the world envied was, for all intents and purposes, an indentured servant. She was trapped in a golden cage, the bars of which were forged from ink and paper in a contract she had signed more than a decade prior, when she was a desperate, hungry starlet named Norma Jean, willing to sell her soul for a chance to be seen. The document that bound Marilyn Monroe to 20th Century Fox was a relic of a dying era, a term contract drafted in 1951. In the early 50s, the studios owned their actors. They dictated what they wore, who they dated, what political opinions they could hold, and, most crucially, what roles they played. If an actor refused a role a practice known as suspension. The studio would simply stop paying them and add the time of the suspension to the end of their contract. It was a form of legal slavery that kept talent in a perpetual state of debt and obligation. By 1962, the industry had changed. Stars like Elizabeth Taylor, Cary Grant, and Marlon Brando had broken free, becoming independent contractors who commanded percentage points of the gross profits and complete creative control. They were the new aristocracy. Marilyn, however, was the last prisoner of the old regime. The financial disparity was not just unfair, it was grotesque. For Something's Got to Give, Marilyn was contractually obligated to receive a flat fee of $100,000. In the isolation of 1962, this was a significant sum for a normal person. But Marilyn Monroe was an industry. After paying her agents, her managers, her publicists, her acting coaches, and the punitive tax rates of the era, she was left with barely enough to maintain the facade of stardom. She was cash poor, often borrowing money to pay her household staff. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Taylor, for her work on Cleopatra, was guaranteed $1 million. Plus 10% of the gross receipts over $7.5 million, plus living expenses that exceeded $3,000 a week. Liz was building a fortune that would last generations. Marilyn was working to pay off yesterday's debts. Every morning she drove through the gates of the Fox lot, she was reminded that to the men in the boardroom, she was worth exactly 1/10 of the woman in Rome. But the cage was not just financial, it was artistic. This was the wound that bled the most. Marilyn had spent the late 1950s fighting to be taken seriously. She had fled Hollywood for New York, studied the method at the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg, and founded her own production company to make films like The Prince and The Showgirl and The Misfits. She had proven to critics and to herself that she was a dramatic actress, capable of profound depth and tragedy. She wanted to play Grushenka in The Brothers Karamazov. She wanted to play complex, broken women. She wanted to age into a serious artist. 20th Century Fox had no interest in Marilyn the artist. They wanted the Marilyn. They wanted the breathy voice, the wiggle, the dumb blonde who didn't know how to turn on a light switch but knew how to stop traffic. They wanted the caricature that sold popcorn. To the executives, her artistic ambitions were an annoyance, a pretension that got in the way of commerce. When they forced Something's Got to Give on her, it was an act of aggression. The script was a remake of a 1940 screwball comedy called My Favorite Wife, a tired recycled property that they had dusted off from the vault. It required her to play a woman who returns from being shipwrecked on a desert island, a role that demanded she be cute, bubbly, and fundamentally shallow. It was a regression, a step backward into the very stereotype she had spent 5 years trying to kill. She hated the script. She fought it. She pleaded with the studio to give her something with substance, something that reflected her maturity. But the studio, bleeding money from the open wound of Cleopatra, was in no mood to negotiate. They needed a commercial guarantee. They needed the Marilyn on a poster by Christmas. They triggered the clauses in her old contract, threatening her with lawsuits and financial ruin if she did not report to work. They weaponized her own poverty against her. It was a classic power play. Do what you are told, be the puppet we created, or we will destroy you. The man enforcing this mandate was Peter Levathes, the head of production at Fox. Levathes was a corporate man, a television executive brought in to streamline the studio. He didn't care about the method or artistic integrity. He looked at Marilyn and saw a unit of production that was malfunctioning. In meetings, the tone was patronizing and cold. They treated her anxiety as a tantrum of a spoiled child. They dismissed her chronic endometriosis and sinusitis as female troubles or psychosomatic excuses. They stripped away her dignity layer by layer. They refused her request for a different director, forcing her to work with George Cukor, a man who had famously directed her in Let's Make Love, and whom she felt despised her improvisational style. They denied her input on the script. They denied her the basic respect afforded to a lead actress. There is a specific kind of psychological torture in being forced to parody yourself. At 36, Marilyn was terrified of aging. She was terrified of losing her looks, which she believed were the only currency she had. The studio's demand that she play the sexy innocent at nearly 40 felt like a cruel joke. It forced her to confront the passage of time in the harshest possible light. Every costume fitting was a battleground where she was squeezed into clothes designed for a younger woman. Every script reading was a reminder that the studio did not see her as a human being evolving through life, but as a static object, a pinup girl frozen in 1953. The tension on the lot was suffocating. When Marilyn arrived at stage 14, she wasn't just walking onto a movie set. She was walking into a prison where the guards were the very people supposed to be her collaborators. The crew, under pressure from the front office to cut costs, watched her with stopwatches. If she took a moment to center herself before a scene, a technique she learned at the actor's studio, eyes would roll. Whispers would circulate. She's doing it again. She's stalling. The atmosphere was thick with resentment. Instead of a woman paralyzed by the fear of mediocrity, they saw a diva wasting their time. And looming over all of this was the specter of her mother. Marilyn lived in constant terror of inheriting her mother's schizophrenia, of losing her mind. The studio knew this. They knew her fragility. And in the summer of 1962, instead of protecting their asset, they began to gaslight her. When she raised valid concerns about the script, they told her she was being hysterical. When she said she was sick, they sent studio doctors to check her temperature, implying she was a liar. They created an environment of paranoia where she felt she was being watched, judged, and sabotaged at every turn. They were pushing her toward the very breakdown she feared most, all to squeeze one last comedy out of her before the empire collapsed. It was a golden cage, yes, but the gold was peeling, revealing the rusted iron underneath. Marilyn Monroe was the most famous woman on earth, yet she had less autonomy than the humblest secretary in the Fox typing pool. She was a queen without a kingdom, a star without a sky, fighting a lonely war against a machine that had already decided she was expendable. The tragedy wasn't that she was refusing to work. The tragedy was that she was desperate to work, to create something beautiful, but the system only wanted her to be a profitable product. And as May turned to June, the product began to crack. May 1962 broke over Los Angeles with a heat wave that seemed to bake the smog into the Hollywood hills. Inside the modest hacienda at 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive, the air conditioning hummed a monotonous drone, battling the temperature outside. In her darkened bedroom, Marilyn Monroe lay shivering under layers of silk sheets, her temperature fluctuating dangerously near 103 degrees. Her sinuses were impacted, a chronic condition that had plagued her for years, turning every breath into a struggle and swelling her face, the most photographed face in human history, into a painful mask. To the medical professionals, this was a clear case of acute viral infection. But to the executives at 20th Century Fox, the daily medical reports were viewed as alibis. In the toxic atmosphere of the studio where the Cleopatra disaster had eroded all trust, sickness was interpreted as negotiation. Spiros Skouras and his head of production, Peter Levathes, looked at the production schedule and saw red. Every day Marilyn stayed in bed cost the production roughly $40,000 in crew salaries, equipment rentals, and overhead. In a normal year, this would be an annoyance. In 1962, with the banks circling the studio like sharks, it was an act of treason. They needed her on set, healthy or not. They began to pressure her doctors, subtly at first, then with increasing aggression, questioning the severity of her condition. They sent studio-appointed physicians to verify her illness, a humiliating intrusion that made Marilyn feel like a prisoner in her own body. It was in this climate of suspicion and surveillance that the invitation arrived. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock embossed with the seal of the President of the United States. John F. Kennedy was holding a fundraising gala at Madison Square Garden in New York City on May 19th, 10 days before his 45th birthday. He wanted Marilyn Monroe to perform. For Marilyn, this invitation was not merely social, it was existential. In Hollywood, she was being treated like a delinquent child, a failing asset, a dumb blonde, fading into obscurity. But the White House, the center of global power, intellect, and Camelot, was treating her as an icon. To stand beside the Kennedys was to be validated as a serious cultural figure, to transcend the tawdry squabbles of the movie business. It was an affirmation of her worth at a time when Fox was stripping it away. She desperately wanted to go. She accepted the invitation, viewing it as a quick weekend trip that would boost her morale, and perhaps, through the sheer magnitude of the publicity, force the studio to treat her with more respect. Fox saw it differently. When Marilyn requested permission to leave production for the weekend to attend the gala, the studio's response was swift and brutal. They denied her request. They issued a direct ultimatum. If she was too sick to work on Something's Got to Give, she was certainly too sick to fly across the country and sing for the president. They warned her that leaving Los Angeles would be considered a willful violation of her contract. It was a line in the sand. They were betting that she wouldn't dare defy them, that the threat of legal action would keep her tethered to her sick bed in Brentwood until she dragged herself back to the soundstage. They underestimated her desperation. On the morning of Thursday, May 17th, Marilyn Monroe defied the order. She boarded a helicopter wrapped in a scarf and dark glasses to hide the swelling in her face, and flew to the airport. She was still running a fever. Her voice was raspy, but she was leaving the cage. The event at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962, is etched into the collective memory of the 20th century. It is remembered for the dress, a sheer flesh-colored marvel designed by Jean Louis, encrusted with 2,500 rhinestones, so tight that Marilyn had to be sewn into it moments before stepping onto the stage. It is remembered for the song, a breathy, intimate rendition of Happy Birthday that felt less like a tribute and more like a public seduction. When she walked out from the darkness into the single spotlight, dropping her white ermine fur to reveal the shimmering illusion of nudity beneath, the gasp from the audience was audible. For 3 minutes, the sick, aging actress vanished. She was a goddess. She commanded the attention of the most powerful man in the free world and 15,000 Democratic donors. She was radiant, invincible, and seemingly in control. But back in Los Angeles, the television sets in the executive offices of 20th Century Fox were tuned to the news reports, and the mood was not one of admiration. It was one of cold, calculating opportunity. To Peter Levathes and the legal department, Marilyn's triumph in New York was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. The logic was simple and ruthless. If she could stand on a stage in New York and look that good, she could have been on stage 14 filming Something's Got to Give. Her appearance at the gala was not seen as a feat of endurance by a sick woman rallying for a special occasion. It was seen as proof of fraud. The trap had been set, and by stepping onto that stage, Marilyn had walked right into it. The studio publicists immediately went to work. They leaked stories to the trades on Monday morning, framing the narrative before Marilyn's plane even touched down in California. Marilyn parties while crew starves, one headline implied. They painted a picture of a spoiled, selfish diva who abandoned hundreds of hardworking crew members, men and women with families to feed, so she could rub elbows with the elite in Manhattan. The narrative shifted overnight. The sympathy for her illness evaporated. The studio had successfully weaponized her stardom against her. Marilyn returned to the set of Something's Got to Give on Monday, May 21st. She was physically depleted. The adrenaline of the gala had worn off, leaving her immune system in ruins. She had flown back to L.A. and gone straight to the studio, trying to prove her commitment. But the atmosphere on stage 14 had shifted from frustration to open hostility. The crew, reading the poison planted in the newspapers by their own employers, looked at her with cold eyes. They stopped greeting her. Director George Cukor, who had been lobbying the studio to fire her for weeks, barely spoke to her, directing her through assistants or with curt, clipped commands. She was filming a scene where her character Ellen Wagstaff Arden returns home. It was a scene demanding lightness, joy, and physical comedy. Marilyn performed it with a mechanical precision, her eyes betraying a deep, haunting sadness. She knew she was in enemy territory. She could feel the walls closing in. The studio was no longer interested in getting the film made. They were interested in building a dossier. Every cough, every request for water, every trip to the dressing room was logged by a script supervisor acting as a spy for the legal department. The footage from those final days in late May shows a woman fighting a losing battle against gravity. She looks beautiful, luminously so, but there is a fragility that is painful to watch. She was trying to do her job, unaware that the decision had already been made. The happy birthday performance, her moment of greatest public glory, had given the studio exactly what they needed, a pretext. They didn't fire her immediately. They waited. They let her work for a few more days, let her exhaust herself further, let the footage pile up. They were waiting for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine, a moment when the maximum amount of blame could be shifted onto her shoulders and away from the financial black hole in Rome. On June 1st, her 36th birthday, she would arrive on set for the last time. The trap was sprung, the evidence was gathered, the narrative was written. All that was left was the execution. The studio prepared the legal notices, drafted the press releases, and calculated the tax write-off. They were about to destroy a human being to balance a spreadsheet. Friday, June 8th, 1962, began with a deceptively quiet morning in Los Angeles. The jacaranda trees were in bloom, dropping purple flowers onto the quiet streets of Brentwood. Inside her bedroom at 12,305 5th Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe woke up with a lingering fever, the remnants of the sinus infection that had plagued her for weeks. She reached for the telephone to call the studio, to update them on her condition, to ask about the shooting schedule for the following week. She expected a tense conversation, perhaps a reprimand from an assistant producer. What she did not know, what she could not see from her darkened room, was that the decision had already been made. The telephone line was dead. The studio was no longer speaking to her. Across town, in the executive building of 20th Century Fox, the silence was replaced by the frantic clatter of typewriters and the shouting of men in expensive suits. Spyros Skouras and Peter Levathes had finished their calculations. The latest financial reports from Rome had arrived, and they were catastrophic. Cleopatra was now projected to lose so much money that the studio's stock price was in freefall. The board of directors in New York demanded blood. They needed a headline that would distract Wall Street, a decisive action that would prove management was taking control of the chaos. They could not fire Elizabeth Taylor. She was the bank vault. They could not fire the director in Rome. The film was too far along. So they turned their gaze to the only vulnerable target left. At approximately noon, the execution order was signed. It was not delivered in person. There was no meeting, no handshake, no acknowledgement of the 15 years Marilyn had spent building the studio's fortune. Instead, a courier was dispatched with a legal document that read like an indictment. Marilyn Monroe was formally fired from Something's Got to Give. The language was deliberately cruel, designed not just to terminate a contract, but to assassinate a character. It cited willful breach of contract and willful failure to perform. It painted her illness as a lie and her struggles as a calculated sabotage. But 20th Century Fox did not stop at firing her. In an unprecedented move, they immediately filed a lawsuit against their own star. They sued Marilyn Monroe for $500,000 in damages, a staggering sum in 1962, equivalent to nearly $5 million today. They claimed her antics had destroyed the production. They leaked the lawsuit to the press before Marilyn even had a chance to read it. By early afternoon, the headline was screaming from every newsstand in America: Fox fires Marilyn. The narrative was set. The studio was the victim. Marilyn was the villain. The brutality of the act was compounded by the speed of her replacement. At the exact moment they announced Marilyn's termination, Fox released a statement that the film would continue with a new leading lady, Lee Remick. Remick was a talented professional actress, younger than Marilyn and crucially far cheaper. The studio had already fitted her for costumes. They had already printed new scripts. This revealed the lie at the heart of the chaos. The studio hadn't been frantically trying to save the film with Marilyn. They had been methodically preparing to replace her for weeks. They had waited until she was weakest, until the public sympathy had waned, to pull the trigger. The most painful betrayal, however, came from the man behind the camera. George Cukor, the legendary director of Something's Got to Give, was known as a woman's director, a man who had guided Katharine Hepburn and Judy Garland to their greatest performances. Marilyn had trusted him despite their creative differences. She believed that, as an artist, he would understand her physical and mental fragility. She was wrong. When the axe fell on June 8th, Cukor didn't stand up for his star. He didn't argue that she was sick. He didn't threaten to quit. Instead, he issued a statement supporting the studio's decision. He effectively endorsed the narrative that Marilyn was impossible, unprofessional, and insane. To Marilyn, this was not just a firing. It was a shunning. The artistic community she revered had turned its back on her to save its own skin. By late afternoon, the physical erasure of Marilyn Monroe began. Security guards at the Fox lot were given new orders. The woman who had generated hundreds of millions of dollars for the corporation was now persona non grata. Her name was scraped off her parking spot. Her bungalow, the dressing room, where she had prepared for the 7-year itch and how to marry a millionaire, was padlocked. Studio employees were ordered to clear out her personal effects, her makeup, her books, her photos of Arthur Miller and Joe DiMaggio, and dump them into cardboard boxes. It was a humiliating spectacle. The queen was not just dethroned, she was evicted. The press had a field day. The gossip columnists, fed a steady diet of lies by the Fox publicity machine, turned on her with vicious glee. Hedda Hopper wrote that Marilyn was washed up, a relic of a bygone era, who had let her ego destroy her talent. They dissected her age, her weight, her mental health. They called her a has-been at 36. The lawsuit hung over her head like a guillotine blade. Fox knew she didn't have $500,000. They knew she was cash poor. The lawsuit wasn't about recovering money. It was about bankruptcy. It was about forcing her into submission, destroying her ability to work anywhere else in Hollywood. In Rome, the news arrived like a distant tremor. Elizabeth Taylor heard about the firing between takes on the Forum set. The irony was suffocating. That very week, Taylor had cost the production another $100,000 due to a nervous stomach and a demand for rewrites. The studio had sent her flowers. For the same crime, they had sent Marilyn a summons. The double standard was now absolute. The industry had divided its women into two categories: the untouchable gods and the disposable mortals. Marilyn had just learned in the most violent way possible which category she belonged to. As the sun set on June 8th, Marilyn sat in her home in Brentwood, surrounded by the silence of a career that had seemingly ended. The phone did not ring. The agents who had promised her the world were suddenly unavailable. The friends who had drunk her champagne were nowhere to be found. She was alone with the terrifying realization that the entity that had created her, Marilyn Monroe, the star, was now trying to kill her. But in that silence, something shifted. The shock of the execution began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard anger. They thought they had buried her. They thought she would disappear quietly into the night, another tragic blonde casualty of the studio system. They were wrong. Marilyn Monroe was down, but she was not dead, and she was about to remind them exactly who she was. The silence that followed the firing on June 8th was not the quiet of a grave. It was the deep breath before a scream. 20th Century Fox had legally terminated Marilyn Monroe, but that was not enough. To justify the lawsuit for $500,000, and more importantly, to distract the shareholders from the financial crater left by Cleopatra, the studio needed to destroy her credibility. They launched a campaign of character assassination so swift, so coordinated, and so vicious that it remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of public relations. It was not enough to say she was fired for being late. They had to make the world believe she was insane. The architects of this destruction were the men in the Fox publicity department, led by Harry Brand, a man who had once helped build the myth of Marilyn Monroe and who now turned his formidable machinery against her. Employing classic black propaganda, they bypassed formal press releases and utilized the Whisper network to dismantle her reputation. They invited friendly journalists to off-the-record lunches at the commissary. They made late-night phone calls to powerful gossip columnists. They leaked exaggerated stories about her behavior on set, painting a picture not of a woman suffering from chronic sinusitis and exhaustion, but of a drug-addled, paranoid lunatic who was rapidly losing her grip on reality. The recipients of these leaks were the two most powerful women in Hollywood journalism, Hedda Hopper and Louella Parsons. For decades, these women had served as the gatekeepers of morality in the movie business. They could make a career with a single compliment or destroy one with a single blind item. Fox fed them a steady diet of poison. On the morning of June 9th, the columns ran headlines that were devastating. Hedda Hopper, writing with a cruelty that bordered on glee, described Marilyn as washed up, a sick woman who had allowed her ego to devour her talent. Parsons, usually more sympathetic, echoed the studio line that Marilyn's antics had cost hundreds of jobs. The narrative was uniform. Marilyn Monroe was not a victim of the studio system. She was the villain who had selfishly put an entire crew out of work because she was too lazy to show up. The studio weaponized her physical appearance. They leaked rumors that she was bloated, that her face was ravaged by drug abuse, that she could no longer fit into her costumes. This was a calculated strike at her most valuable asset, her beauty. By suggesting she was physically repulsive, they were telling the public that the sex symbol was dead. They were trying to devalue her market worth to zero. They whispered that she was incoherent on set, that she couldn't remember a single line of dialogue, that she required cue cards for even the simplest sentences. While it was true that Marilyn often struggled with lines, due to her reliance on the method and her anxiety, the studio exaggerated this into a portrait of total cognitive collapse. They made her sound like a shuffling, mumbling wreck, effectively rendering her unemployable by any other major studio. The cruelty of this campaign was magnified by the double standard applied to the production in Rome. At the exact moment Fox was painting Marilyn as a mentally unstable liability for missing a few days of work, Elizabeth Taylor was causing riots in Italy. Her affair with Richard Burton was a public scandal involving the Vatican, the U.S. Congress, and 2 broken marriages. She was drinking heavily. She was delaying production with demands that would have made a queen blush. Yet the Fox publicity machine treated Liz's chaos as romantic turbulence. Her instability was framed as the passion of a great artist. Marilyn's instability was framed as the pathology of a mental patient. One was a star, the other was a case study. The motive behind this vitriol was purely economic. Spyros Skouras was facing a shareholder meeting where he would have to explain a $40 million loss. He could not stand up and say, "I let the Cleopatra production run out of control." He needed a scapegoat. By demonizing Marilyn, he was creating a narrative of fiscal responsibility. He could point to her firing and say, "Look, we are cracking down. We are cutting the dead wood. We are taking control." Marilyn became the human sacrifice offered up to the god of the bottom line. The lawsuit against her was not about recovering the money. Fox knew she didn't have it. It was about crushing her so completely that she couldn't fight back. It was about intimidation. For Marilyn, isolated in her Brentwood home, reading these newspapers was a form of psychological torture. She had given 15 years of her life to this studio. She had posed for thousands of photos, attended hundreds of premieres, and made them millions of dollars. She had trusted men like Harry Brand. Now she saw her own life being rewritten by the people she had made rich. She saw her illness mocked. She saw her integrity questioned. The betrayal cut deeper than the firing itself. She realized that to these men she was a product, a carton of milk that had reached its expiration date and was now being poured down the drain. The public initially believed the lies. The power of the studio system and the gossip columnists was absolute in 1962. There was no social media, no alternative news source. If Hedda Hopper said Marilyn was crazy, then Marilyn was crazy. Friends stopped calling. Producers who had been begging for her scripts suddenly went silent. She was radioactive. The smear campaign had worked. She was effectively blacklisted, a pariah in the town she had conquered. But the studio had made a critical error. In their zeal to destroy her, they had pushed too hard. They had made the narrative too one-sided, too cruel. They had forgotten that Marilyn Monroe had a connection with the public that bypassed the studio executives and the gossip columnists. They had forgotten that the audience didn't love her because she was perfect. They loved her because she was vulnerable. And as the initial shock of the firing wore off, a subtle shift began to occur. The sheer viciousness of the attack began to look suspicious. The crazy woman narrative didn't quite fit with the memory of the glowing, radiant creature who had sung to the president just weeks before. In the silence of her exile, Marilyn Monroe stopped crying. She realized that she could not fight the studio with lawyers, and she could not fight them with press releases. They owned the press. She had to fight them with the only weapon she had left. The weapon they were trying to tell the world was broken. Her image. She had to show the world the truth, not with words, but with her body. She had to prove that the washed-up wreck described in the papers was a lie. And so, as the smear campaign reached its fever pitch, Marilyn picked up the phone and made a call that would change the course of the war. She didn't call a lawyer. She called a photographer. The counterattack began in the blue chlorinated water of a swimming pool. Back in the final days of May, just a week before her termination, the studio was already leaking stories. Just a week before her termination, the studio was already leaking stories about her physical deterioration. They were whispering that she was bloated, unkempt, and ravaged by illness. They were preparing the public for her erasure. Marilyn, with an instinct honed by 20 years of survival, sensed the walls closing in. She knew she needed a weapon to cut through the noise. She needed to prove, undeniably and visually, that she was still the most potent currency in Hollywood. The scene was set for a sequence in Something's Got to Give, where her character Ellen goes for a night swim. The script called for her to wear a flesh-colored bathing suit, a standard trick of the trade to imply nudity without actually showing it. But Marilyn had a different idea. She approached photographer Lawrence Schiller with a proposal that was both desperate and brilliant. She didn't just want a cover, she wanted a weapon. Her instruction was explicit. I want to push Liz Taylor off the magazine stands. She knew she couldn't fight Fox with lawyers, so she decided to fight them with the one thing Liz Taylor didn't have, the raw, vulnerable heat that made the world fall in love with her. On the evening of May 30th, the set was closed. The crew was reduced to a skeleton staff. The water was heated to exactly body temperature. Marilyn slipped into the pool wearing the beige suit, swam a few laps, and then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, peeled it off beneath the surface. She emerged at the edge of the pool, her bare shoulders glistening, her smile radiant, holding the wet suit in her hand like a trophy. Schiller's camera motor drive whirred, capturing frame after frame of a woman who looked nothing like the sick, neurotic wreck described in the Fox memos. She looked vibrant. She looked healthy. She looked triumphant. When Fox fired her on June 8th and unleashed their smear campaign, they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed the narrative was theirs to control. They didn't know that Marilyn and Schiller had already selected the images that would destroy their lies. On June 22nd, 1962, 2 weeks after her firing, Life magazine hit newsstands across America. Instead of a haggard, drug-addled has-been, the cover featured Marilyn Monroe, emerging from the blue water, head thrown back in laughter, looking more beautiful than she had in a decade. The headline was a masterpiece of irony. The skinny dip you'll never see. Inside, the spread revealed the nude photos, tasteful, artistic, but undeniably raw. The impact was nuclear. The public, who had been fed a steady diet of stories about Marilyn's mental and physical collapse, looked at the photos and saw a lie. How could this glowing, joyous woman be the same person Fox claimed was too sick to work? How could this vibrant creature be the washed-up liability described by Hedda Hopper? The photos provided objective, irrefutable proof of her vitality. They made the studio executives look like liars, or worse, like bullies, who were trying to crush a woman in her prime. Marilyn had effectively bypassed the studio system. In the old days, the studio controlled every image of a star. They approved every still, every portrait. By working directly with Schiller and Life, Marilyn seized control of her own image distribution. She went directly to the consumer. The magazine sold out instantly. It became one of the highest-selling issues in Life's history. The message was clear. The public didn't care about the budget of Something's Got to Give. They didn't care about the delays. They cared about Marilyn. This visual evidence forced a shift in the cultural conversation. The narrative moved from Marilyn the failure to Marilyn the victim. People began to ask why Fox was treating this obvious superstar with such contempt while indulging Elizabeth Taylor's every whim in Rome. The photos highlighted the absurdity of the studio's position. If Marilyn looked this good, why fire her? Why sue her? Why not just finish the movie? The Last Sitting, a separate photo session conducted by Bert Stern for Vogue, around the same time reinforced this counter-narrative. In those photos, taken at the Hotel Bel Air, Marilyn appeared more modern, more fashion-forward, stripping away the heavy makeup of the 50s for a fresher, more open look. She was rebranding herself in real time. She was showing the industry that she was ready for the 1960s, that she wasn't a relic. Fox was caught flat-footed. They had spent weeks painting a portrait of a monster, and Marilyn had responded with a portrait of an angel. The legal department at Fox, which had been so aggressive with their lawsuit, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. The public sentiment was turning against the corporation. The crazy woman defense was crumbling. Crucially, these photos also served as a signal to the rest of the industry. Other producers, other directors, and other actors looked at the Life cover and saw a star who was still bankable. They saw the heat. In Hollywood, heat is everything. By generating this massive global buzz on her own terms, Marilyn proved that her star power was independent of 20th Century Fox. She didn't need the studio to be famous. The studio needed her. This was the naked truth of the summer of 1962. It wasn't about nudity. It was about transparency. Marilyn stripped away the costumes, the characters, and the studio spin to reveal the human being underneath. She used her body, the very thing the studio had commodified for years, as a shield and a sword. It was a brilliant, desperate gamble, and it worked. It stopped the smear campaign in its tracks. It forced the world to look at her not as a problem to be solved, but as a treasure to be saved. And among the people watching this unfold was a man who had remained silent until now, a man whose loyalty would deliver the final blow to Fox's plans. Dean Martin looked at the magazine, looked at his contract, and decided it was time to pick a side. On the morning of Monday, June 11th, 1962, the executives at 20th Century Fox believed they had solved the problem. The Marilyn Monroe situation, as it was euphemistically called in inter-office memos, had been dealt with decisively. She was fired. She was sued. The smear campaign was in full swing, dismantling her reputation with brutal efficiency. Now the studio moved to the second phase of their plan, the replacement. They had already cast Lee Remick, a talented, beautiful, and remarkably professional actress who was everything Marilyn was not: punctual, obedient, and cheap. Remick was flown to Los Angeles immediately. The costume department was ordered to refit Marilyn's wardrobe for her. The publicity department began drafting press releases announcing a new, fresher look for Something's Got to Give. The studio's logic was cold and corporate. The movie was a product, the script was a blueprint, and the actress was merely an interchangeable part. They assumed that with Marilyn gone, the chaos would vanish. The production would wrap on schedule, and they would have a modest hit to appease the shareholders by Christmas. They were treating Hollywood like a factory assembly line. They had forgotten about the human element. Specifically, they had forgotten about Dean Martin. In 1962, Dean Martin was untouchable. He was not just a movie star. He was a recording artist, a television personality, and a founding member of the Rat Pack. He projected an image of effortless cool, of a man who didn't care about the rules because he didn't have to. Unlike the desperate executives at Fox, Dean Martin did not need this movie. He had a few money, he had power, and crucially, he had a contract that gave him something Marilyn never had: co-star approval. When Fox announced Lee Remick as the replacement, they did so without consulting him. They assumed he would be relieved to be rid of the difficult Marilyn Monroe. They assumed he would appreciate the professionalism of Lee Remick. It was a staggering miscalculation of his character and his loyalty. Dean Martin liked Marilyn. He respected her comedic timing. He understood that her difficulty was often a mask for her perfectionism and her anxiety. But more than that, he understood the business. He knew that Something's Got to Give was a flimsy, mediocre script. The only thing that made it special, the only thing that made it a potential blockbuster, was the chemistry between him and Marilyn. Without her, it was just another B-movie comedy. So while Fox was busy measuring Lee Remick for costumes, Dean Martin quietly walked off the set. Bypassing press conferences and public tantrums, he simply sent a message to the studio that hit with the force of a nuclear bomb. "I have a contract to do this picture with Marilyn Monroe," he said, "and I will do it with no one else." It was a mutiny. It was a direct challenge to the authority of Spyro Skouras and the entire studio system. For decades, studios had dictated terms to actors. Now, one actor was dictating terms to the studio. Dean Martin was effectively saying that the studio's judgment was wrong, that their solution was unacceptable, and that without the woman they had just fired and sued, there would be no movie at all. Fox panicked. They tried to bully him. They threatened to sue him for breach of contract, just as they had sued Marilyn. They replaced him with Rock Hudson, hoping to salvage the production with a new male lead to go with their new female lead. But the house of cards collapsed. Lee Remick, realizing she had walked into a political war zone, withdrew from the project out of respect for Marilyn. The director, George Cukor, who had been so eager to move on from Marilyn, suddenly found himself with no cast, no movie, and a destroyed reputation. The production of Something's Got to Give shut down completely. The soundstage went dark. The crew was sent home. The modest hit that was supposed to save the studio from the Cleopatra disaster had turned into another expensive catastrophe. This mutiny changed the entire dynamic of the war. Until this moment, Fox had successfully framed Marilyn as a liability, a destroyer of production. Dean Martin's refusal to work without her flipped that narrative on its head. By staking his own reputation on her value, he validated her. He told the world that Marilyn Monroe was essential. He told the shareholders that the executives had made a mistake that was now costing them even more money than Marilyn's lateness ever had. The lawsuit against Marilyn, the $500,000 bludgeon Fox was using to destroy her suddenly looked ridiculous. How could they claim she had willfully destroyed the picture when their own leading man was willing to walk away rather than work without her? The legal ground beneath Fox began to crumble. For Marilyn, isolated in Brentwood, Dean Martin's stand was a lifeline. It was the first time in weeks that a powerful man in Hollywood had stood up for her. It broke the isolation. It cracked the blacklist. It proved that she was not alone. The smear campaign, which had relied on portraying her as universally hated by her colleagues, fell apart. The executives at Fox were now backed into a corner. They had fired their star to save money, and the result was that they had lost the entire production. They had tried to show strength, and instead they had exposed their weakness. They realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that they had only one option left. It was the option they hated most. They would have to crawl back to the woman they had just tried to destroy. They would have to negotiate. The Marilyn Monroe situation was no longer a cleanup operation. It was a hostage negotiation, and thanks to Dean Martin, the hostage had just been handed a loaded gun. The power had shifted. The studio system, which had ruled Hollywood with an iron fist for 40 years, had blinked. And Marilyn, battered but still standing, was ready to make them pay for every insult. The stage was set for the most unlikely comeback in Hollywood history. By late July 1962, the executive corridors of 20th Century Fox resembled a bunker under siege. The strategy of total war against Marilyn Monroe had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. The studio had fired their star to assert dominance, only to have their leading man, Dean Martin, effectively fire the studio in return. Production on Something's Got to Give was dead in the water. A silent soundstage costing them money every day, it sat empty. Meanwhile, the financial black hole of Cleopatra in Rome continued to expand, sucking the life out of the corporation. The board of directors in New York looked at the wreckage of their summer strategy and realized they had played a game of chicken with a woman who had nothing left to lose, and she had not blinked. Spiros Skouras, the architect of this disaster, was a dead man walking. On June 27th, under immense pressure from Wall Street, he submitted his resignation as president of 20th Century Fox. The man who had authorized the firing of Marilyn Monroe was himself fired before the month was out. It was a stunning collapse of authority. The new regime, desperate to salvage something from the ruins, looked at the ledger and came to a humiliating conclusion. They needed Marilyn back. They needed the crazy, washed-up woman they had just sued for $500,000 to save them. The negotiations that followed were a study in corporate hypocrisy. The same lawyers who had drafted the lawsuit claiming Marilyn had willfully destroyed the picture were now sitting across the table from Marilyn's attorney, Mickey Rudin, drafting a new contract to bring her back. The studio's leverage had evaporated. They couldn't threaten her career anymore. Dean Martin had protected that. They couldn't threaten her with poverty. The Life magazine photos proved she was still a gold mine. They had to beg. On August 1st, 1962, a deal was struck. It was a total capitulation by the studio. Under the terms of the new agreement, Marilyn Monroe would return to Something's Got to Give, but the terms were radically different. Her salary, previously a humiliating $100,000, was raised to $250,000, a 250% increase. More importantly, the studio agreed to pay her immediately, acknowledging her financial distress. They also conceded on the creative front. George Cukor, the director who had turned his back on her during the firing, was removed from the project. In his place, the studio tentatively agreed to hire Jean Negulesco, a director Marilyn trusted and who had successfully guided her in How to Marry a Millionaire. It was the greatest comeback in Hollywood history. A single actress fighting alone against a multinational corporation, the press, and the legal system had won. She had forced the studio to rewrite the rules of engagement. She had exposed the star system as a paper tiger. When the news broke, the headlines were triumphant. Marilyn wins. Fox crawls back. To the public, it was a fairy tale ending. The underdog had prevailed. The queen had regained her throne. But victories in war are rarely clean, and this one was Pyrrhic in the truest sense of the word. The ancient king Pyrrhus, after defeating the Romans at Heraclea, famously said, "Another such victory, and we are undone." Marilyn Monroe had defeated 20th Century Fox, but the battle had consumed everything she had left. The woman who signed that contract on August 1st was not the triumphant warrior the newspapers described. She was a shell. The 8 weeks of psychological warfare, the public shaming, the betrayal of friends, the invasive surveillance, the fear of bankruptcy, had shattered her nervous system. She was suffering from severe depression. Her insomnia, always a demon, had become a monster that no amount of Nembutal could slay. She was living in a twilight state, oscillating between manic highs of vindication and crushing lows of paranoia. The reinstatement did not bring relief. It brought a new kind of terror. Now she had to go back. She had to return to the lot where they had humiliated her. She had to face the crew who had read the smear pieces about her insanity. She had to perform a comedy while feeling like a tragedy. The pressure to deliver was now even higher than before. If she failed this second chance, the studio would be vindicated. They would say, "We told you so." She was walking back into the lion's den, and she knew she was too weak to fight another round. Her reliance on her doctors, particularly her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, intensified. She was seeing him daily, sometimes twice a day. The chemical crutch of barbiturates and sedatives, which the studio had mocked her for, became her only way to survive the day. The victory had not cured her. It had isolated her further. She felt the weight of the victory as a burden, a demand that she be Marilyn Monroe, the invincible icon, when all she wanted was to be Norma Jean, the human being who needed rest. In the days following the agreement, Marilyn began to make plans for the future. She spoke of finishing the film in October. She looked at scripts for future projects. She scheduled fittings. But there was a disjointed quality to her actions, a sense of a woman going through the motions of life while her spirit remained stuck in the trauma of June. The joy of winning was absent. When friends congratulated her, her smiles were fleeting, ghost-like. She knew perhaps better than anyone that the studio had not forgiven her. They had only paused the hostilities because they needed the money. She was still a commodity. She was still a piece of property, just a more expensive one now. The tragedy of the Cleopatra War is that it ended with a surrender that solved nothing. The studio got their star back, but they had broken her in the process. They had pushed a fragile woman to the absolute limit of human endurance. And then, when she didn't break immediately, they pushed harder. The new contract was not a peace treaty. It was a receipt for damaged goods. As the sun set on August 3rd, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was technically the winner. She had the money, she had the power, she had the last laugh. But inside the quiet hacienda in Brentwood, the silence was deafening. The phone calls from the studio had stopped, replaced by the internal monologue of a woman who had been told by the world that she was worthless, then told she was priceless, all in the span of 60 days. The whiplash was lethal. She retreated into her bedroom, into the velvet darkness, clutching the phone that was her only lifeline to the outside world. The war was over, but the casualties were yet to be counted, and the silence of the coming weekend would be the loudest sound Hollywood had ever heard. Saturday, August 4th, 1962, dawned over Los Angeles with the heavy, stagnant heat of late summer. In the quiet enclave of Brentwood, the hacienda at 12,305 Fifth Helena Drive sat behind its high walls, shielding its occupant from the world she had just conquered. To an outside observer, this should have been a weekend of celebration. Marilyn Monroe had stared down the 20th Century Fox empire and won. She had her contract back, her salary doubled, and her dignity restored. But inside the house, the atmosphere was not one of victory. It was one of disjointed, frantic exhaustion. The war was over, but the soldier was still trembling. Marilyn spent the morning in a state of fluctuating moods, a symptom of the intense chemical regimen she'd been prescribed to cope with the summer's brutality. One moment she was lucid and making plans for the future. The next, she was irritable and despondent. Her publicist, Pat Newcomb, had slept over the night before, and the two women woke to a tension that quickly escalated into a petty argument. It was the kind of meaningless friction that arises when nerves are frayed to the breaking point. The stress of the lawsuit, the smear campaign, and the sudden reversal of fortune had left Marilyn's emotional skin paper thin. She kicked Newcomb out of the house before noon, isolating herself further in the dim curtained rooms of her sanctuary. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, arrived in the afternoon for a session that lasted hours. Greenson was more than a doctor. In the vacuum left by the studio's abandonment, he had become a father figure, a confessor, and a controller. He found Marilyn in a state of agitation. She was terrified of the upcoming Monday. The victory meant she had to go back to work. She had to face the cameras, the crew, and the executives who had spent 2 months calling her insane. The pressure to be perfect was crushing. She asked Greenson to prescribe her Mornembutal, the yellow capsules that were the only things that could turn off the noise in her head. He refused, wary of her dependency, but the house was already stocked with bottles from other doctors, a pharmacy of escape within arm's reach. As evening fell, the Santa Ana wines began to blow, drying out the air and charging the atmosphere with a strange electricity. Dr. Greenson left around 7 p.m., urging her to rest. He asked her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, to stay the night and keep an eye on her. The house settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the ringing of the telephone, Marilyn's lifeline. The phone calls she made that night paint a picture not of a woman planning to die, but of a woman desperately trying to live. She called her ex-husband's son, Joe DiMaggio Jr., around 7:30 p.m. She was cheerful, happy to hear he had broken off an engagement she disapproved of. They talked about the future. She sounded optimistic. This was the Marilyn who had just won the war, resilient, hopeful, looking forward. But minutes later, the darkness returned. She called Peter Lawford, the actor and Kennedy brother-in-law, to decline an invitation to a dinner party. Her voice was slurred. The cheerfulness had evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy melancholy. She told him, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy." Lawford, alarmed, tried to call back, but the line was busy. Marilyn had left the phone off the hook. It was a cry for help, or perhaps just a drift into the fog. In the solitude of her bedroom, surrounded by scripts she couldn't focus on and contracts she had fought to sign, Marilyn sought the only peace she knew. She sought refuge in the Nembutal to silence the anxiety, desperate to sleep so she could be beautiful for Monday. She was trying to turn off the voice of Spiros Skouras, the voice of Hedda Hopper, the voice of the studio that told her she was worthless. In the quiet desperation of that night, the dosage ceased to matter. The chemical crutch the studio had mocked tragically became a chemical weapon. The timeline of the night blurs into tragedy. Sometime after midnight, the housekeeper, Eunice Murray, woke up with an unsettling feeling. She saw light spilling from under Marilyn's bedroom door. She knocked. There was no answer. She tried the knob. It was locked. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the quiet of the house. Murray called Dr. Greenson. He rushed over, breaking a window with a fireplace poker to gain entry. The room was still. The air was heavy with the smell of stale perfume and impending death. Marilyn lay face down on the bed, tangled in the champagne-colored sheets. Her hand was clutching the telephone receiver as if she had tried in the final moment to reach out one last time, but the line was dead. At 3:50 a.m. on August 5, 1962, Dr. Hyman Engelberg pronounced her dead. The cause, acute barbiturate poisoning. Probable suicide, the coroner would later write. But the word suicide implies a deliberate decision, a single moment of choice. What happened in that bedroom was the culmination of a slow, systematic dismantling of a human spirit. The police arrived as the first gray light of dawn touched the Hollywood Hills. The flashbulbs that had courted her for 15 years now popped with a clinical forensic coldness. They photographed the empty pill bottles on the nightstand, Nembutal, chloral hydrate. They photographed the scripts for Something's Got to Give stacked on the floor. They photographed the body of the woman who had generated millions of dollars for 20th Century Fox, now covered by a simple sheet, being wheeled out on a gurney past the swimming pool where she had posed for her final victory. The news broke like a thunderclap. Marilyn is dead. It traveled across the wires, interrupting broadcasts, stopping presses. In New York, the executives who had just rehired her woke up to the realization that their asset was gone. In Rome, Elizabeth Taylor reportedly wept, understanding perhaps better than anyone the unbearable weight that had crushed her rival. The house on 5th Helena Drive was suddenly a crime scene, but the real crime had been committed over the previous 8 weeks in boardrooms and lawyers' offices. The system had pushed her into the corner, stripped her of her confidence, isolated her from her work, and then when she was on her knees, handed her a victory that was too heavy to carry. She had won the battle for her contract, but she had lost the war for her soul. As the coroner's van drove away, taking the most famous woman in the world to a cold metal slab in the county morgue, the telephone in her bedroom finally stopped ringing. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of an industry that had eaten its own child. The silence of a dumb blonde who was too smart to survive the cruelty of her creators. The silence of a night where the only thing louder than the wind was the sound of a heart breaking under the weight of $1 million deal. On August 8, 1962, the sun beat down on the small, nondescript Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. It was a private affair, stripped of the pomp and circumstance that had defined Marilyn Monroe's life. There were no flashing cameras allowed inside the gates. There were no studio executives. There were no producers. Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's second husband, and the man who had loved her most fiercely, had barred them all. If it wasn't for them, he told friends, his voice trembling with a rage that would last for the rest of his life, she would still be here. He blamed the industry. He blamed the relentless machinery of 20th Century Fox that had chewed her up and spat her out. as he leaned over her casket whispering, "I love you, I love you, I love you." He wasn't just saying goodbye to a woman. He was closing the door on an era. The funeral was the first sign that the studio's narrative had failed. They had tried to paint her as a discardable asset, a chaotic element that needed to be purged. But in death, Marilyn Monroe instantly ascended to a level of martyrdom that no smear campaign could touch. The public grief was overwhelming. In Europe, suicide spiked in the week following her death. In New York, secretaries wept at their desks. The world realized too late that the dumb blonde was a mask for a soul of profound sensitivity. The studio had killed the golden goose, and now they were left holding nothing but the bloody knife. The fallout for 20th Century Fox was immediate and devastating. The Marilyn Monroe situation, which Spyro Skouras had tried to manage with such cold brutality, became his undoing. The board of directors, seeing the public backlash and the continued hemorrhaging of money, finally acted. Skouras, the emperor who had ruled the studio for 20 years, was forced out of his presidency. He was replaced by Darryl F. Zanuck, the studio's founder, who returned from exile to save the sinking ship. Skouras's gamble had failed. Sacrificing Marilyn did not save his job. It only cemented his legacy as the man who drove Hollywood's greatest star to her grave. And what of the movie that started the war? Cleopatra finally limped into theaters in June 1963, nearly a year after Marilyn's death. It was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, a 4-hour epic dripping in gold and hubris. It became the highest-grossing film of the year, earning over $57 million. Yet the cost of production and marketing had been so astronomical, final estimates pushed past $44 million, that the film still lost money. It took years for Fox to break even. The movie that was supposed to save the empire ended up forcing the studio to sell off its most valuable asset, the backlot itself. The land where Marilyn had walked, where she had filmed The 7-Year Itch, was sold to developers to build Century City. The physical history of the studio was paved over to pay for Elizabeth Taylor's costumes. The death of Marilyn Monroe marked the definitive end of the studio system. The old model where actors were contracted employees owned by the corporation died with her. Her rebellion, her firing, and her tragic end exposed the cruelty of that arrangement to the world. A new generation of actors looked at what happened to her and refused to sign long-term deals. They demanded independence. They demanded control. The balance of power shifted permanently from the boardroom to the talent. The star system that had created Marilyn Monroe collapsed under the weight of its own inhumanity. Elizabeth Taylor, the other queen on the chessboard, survived. She went on to win an Academy Award, not for Cleopatra, but for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, a film where she stripped away her glamour to play a broken, alcoholic woman. In a strange twist of fate, she achieved the artistic respect Marilyn had died trying to find. Taylor lived for another half-century, becoming a tireless activist, a dame, and a survivor of the very machine that had destroyed her rival. She rarely spoke of the summer of 1962, but when she did, it was with a deep, knowing sadness. She knew she had been the lucky one. Something's Got to Give remained unfinished, a ghost film. For decades, the footage sat in a vault, unseen. When it was finally assembled and released in a documentary in 2001, audiences were stunned. They saw a Marilyn Monroe who was luminous, funny, and heartbreakingly beautiful. They saw the work of a brilliant comedian at the height of her powers, not the stumbling wreck described by the studio. The footage was the final vindication. It proved that the studio had lied. They hadn't fired a washed-up has-been, they had fired a genius.